June 27, 1950. Itazuke Air Base, Japan. The air is thick with humidity and the sharp, metallic tang of high-octane aviation fuel. On the tarmac, rows of sleek, polished aluminum silhouettes stand ready. Not the screaming jet-powered F-80 shooting stars that represented the future, but the familiar, shark-like profiles of North American F-51 Mustangs. 5 years after the surrender on the USS Missouri, the Cadillac of the skies should have been a relic of a bygone era, a museum piece destined for the scrap heap. Instead, as the first frantic reports of North Korean T-34 tanks crossing the 38th parallel filter through the wires, pilots scramble toward their cockpits. The familiar whine of the inertial starter gives way to the thunderous, rhythmic cough of a Packard V1650 Merlin engine. As the propellers blur into shimmering discs, these pilots aren't preparing for a high-altitude duel over Berlin or a long-range escort to Tokyo. They are preparing to dive into the jagged, frozen valleys of the Korean Peninsula, flying a World War II legend into a conflict of brutal attrition. The Mustang wasn't finished in 1945. For thousands of these airframes, the most treacherous miles were only just beginning. By the late summer of 1945, the United States possessed the most formidable air armada in human history. The North American P-51 Mustang had ended the war in Europe as the undisputed king of the skies, a long-range predator that had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. But with the sudden silence of the guns after VJ Day, the American industrial machine faced a logistical nightmare. What to do with over 15,000 Mustangs that were suddenly without a mission? Almost overnight, the demand for high-performance piston fighters evaporated. The War Assets Administration was tasked with a monumental liquidation, and the results were staggering. Across the American Southwest, airfields like Kingman, Arizona, and Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, were transformed into massive boneyards. From the air, these bases looked like shimmering lakes of silver as thousands of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Fortresses were parked wingtip to wingtip. For the P-51, the transition was jarring. Aircraft that had cost the taxpayer roughly $50,000 to produce were being sold as surplus for as little as $3,500, roughly the price of a high-end luxury car at the time. Many were simply towed to the smelters, where their high-grade aluminum was melted down to create the consumer goods of the post-war boom: refrigerators, soda cans, and window frames. The era of the piston-driven dogfighter seemed to be closing its eyes as the first primitive jet engines began to howl in the distance. However, the dawn of the Cold War ensured that the Mustang would not vanish entirely. In 1947, the United States Air Force was established as an independent branch, and one of its first administrative acts was to change the P for pursuit designation to F for fighter. The P-51 Mustang became the F-51. Despite the burgeoning allure of the jet age, the early jets like the F-80 Shooting Star were temperamental, fuel-hungry, and lacked the range required for global policing. The F-51 remained the backbone of the Tactical Air Command and the newly formed Air National Guard. It was a known quantity, a reliable, rugged, and lethal platform that was kept in the inventory not out of sentimentality, but out of necessity. The military leadership knew that while jets would win the next high-altitude air battle, the Mustang was still the finest tool available for the dirty work of tactical aviation. As the 1940s drew to a close, the Mustang was also finding its way into the hands of America's allies. Through the Mutual Defense Assistance Act, F-51s were shipped by the hundreds to nations struggling to rebuild their air forces. From the Royal Australian Air Force to the newly formed Israeli Air Force, the Mustang became the gold standard for emerging military powers. It was cheap to maintain, relatively easy to fly, and packed a punch that few other aircraft could match. In the United States, the Mustang was relegated to the second string, relegated to weekend warriors in the National Guard who spent their Sunday mornings practicing strafing runs over the American countryside. It was a quiet, dignified semi-retirement for a war hero, but the shifting geopolitical landscape of the Far East was about to demand one final, bloody performance from the thoroughbred. While the boneyards claimed thousands of airframes, the high-level strategists in Washington were grappling with a terrifying new reality: the nuclear standoff. In the late 1940s, the United States held the atomic monopoly, but it lacked a truly reliable way to deliver those weapons deep into Soviet territory and protect the bombers doing the job. The massive B-36 Peacemaker was entering service, but the jet fighters of the era, like the early F-84 Thunderjet, simply did not have the legs to accompany bombers on missions spanning thousands of miles. This logistical void forced the U.S. Air Force to lean heavily on the F-51 Mustang as an interim solution for long-range escort duties. It was the only fighter in the inventory with the proven endurance to stay aloft for 7 or 8 hours at a time, provided the pilot could endure the physical toll of the cramped cockpit. This period saw the Mustang integrated into the Strategic Air Command, SSC, serving as a stopgap measure while the aerospace industry scrambled to develop penetration fighters. The Mustang was no longer the cutting edge, but it was the bridge between two eras of warfare. During this time, the Mustang also saw its final major design evolution in the form of the F-82 Twin Mustang. This bizarre-looking aircraft consisted of two P-51 fuselages joined by a common center wing and tail. It was designed specifically for the ultra-long-range missions of the Pacific Theater that never came to pass in 1945, but by 1948, it was patrolling the skies over Japan and the Aleutian Islands. The Twin Mustang represented the absolute zenith of piston engine technology, a twin-engine monster capable of flying from New York to London nonstop without refueling. As the decade turned, the Mustang's role began to shift from the global stage to the domestic one. The Air National Guard, ANG, became the primary operator of the F-51D, with units in almost every state keeping the Merlin engines humming. For many World War II veterans, the Mustang was a familiar friend. They transitioned from combat in the European theater to weekend drills over the Midwest. However, the atmosphere of the late 1940s was one of complacency. Many believed the piston-powered fighter would never see combat again. The prevailing theory was that any future war would be fought with atomic bombs and supersonic interceptors. The Mustang was viewed as a trainer, a target tug, or a hack aircraft for officers to maintain their flight hours. That complacency shattered on a Sunday morning in June 1950. When North Korean forces surged across the border, the United States was caught in a state of military atrophy. The sophisticated jets stationed in Japan were ill-suited for the primitive, short, and often unpaved runways of the Korean peninsula. Furthermore, the F-80 jets had such limited loiter time that they could only spend minutes over the battlefield before needing to return to base. The call went out for a rugged, long-endurance aircraft that could operate out of the mud and provide immediate close air support to retreating ground troops. The obsolete Mustang was suddenly the most important aircraft in the theater, pulled from its quiet life in the National Guard and thrust back into the crucible of fire. The first angle of the Mustang's post-war life is defined by a radical and dangerous shift in its tactical application. In the skies over occupied Europe, the P-51 had been a high-altitude thoroughbred, optimized for the thin air at $25,000 to $30,000 feet. Its laminar flow wing and two-stage supercharger made it a graceful interceptor, designed to kill other aircraft. However, in the rugged terrain of Korea, the F-51 was forced into the role of a mud mover, a low-level ground attack platform. This was a mission for which the aircraft was never truly intended. The Mustang's belly-mounted radiator, crucial for cooling that massive Merlin engine, became its Achilles heel. While a rugged air-cooled radial engine like that of the P-47 Thunderbolt could soak up machine gun fire and keep turning, the Mustang's cooling system was fragile. A single rifle-caliber bullet through the radiator scoop would cause the engine to seize within minutes as the coolant bled out. Consequently, Mustang pilots in Korea had to fly at terrifyingly low altitudes, often skimming the treetops, to deliver napalm, rockets, and .50 caliber fire onto North Korean supply lines. This was down and dirty warfare where the enemy wasn't a Messerschmitt, but a concealed anti-aircraft battery or even a soldier with a bolt-action rifle. The Mustang proved to be a devastatingly accurate platform for this work, but the price paid in airframes and pilots was staggering compared to the high-altitude duels of 1944. Technologically, the Mustang's post-1945 journey saw it reach its absolute physical limits. The F-51D, the iconic bubble canopy version, was joined and eventually overshadowed by the P-51H. The H model was the fastest production Mustang ever built, lightened and refined to reach speeds of $487 mph. It was a hot rod designed to intercept Japanese kamikazes, but it arrived too late for World War II and spent its short life in the shadows of the jet age. Yet, the true technological marvel of this era was the F-82 twin Mustang. The F-82 was more than just two Mustangs bolted together. It was a sophisticated long-range interceptor equipped with a massive radar pod suspended under the center wing. During the opening days of the Korean War, it was an F-82 of the 68th Fighter All-Weather Squadron that scored the first aerial victory of the conflict, splashing a North Korean Yak-11. The twin Mustang allowed for two pilot crews to share the immense fatigue of long-range patrols over the Sea of Japan, proving that even as the world moved toward the jet engine, the piston-driven airframe still had unique, specialized roles that the early, fuel-thirsty jets simply could not fill. The third angle of the Mustang's post-war life is its transformation into the primary muscle for dozens of nations across the globe. As the United States and Great Britain began to phase out piston engine fighters in favor of jet technology, thousands of P-51s were sold, leased, or gifted to allies under various military assistance programs. This created a global diaspora where the Mustang became the centerpiece of burgeoning air forces in South America, the Middle East, and Asia. In the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the newly formed Israeli Air Force, IAF, desperately sought out Mustangs, often smuggling them as surplus parts to bypass embargoes. Once assembled, these aircraft became the IAF's first true air superiority fighters, proving that a World War II veteran could still dictate the terms of a modern regional conflict. In Latin America, the Mustang's career lasted well into the 1960s and even the 70s. For nations like the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, the F-51 was the ultimate symbol of national power. It was easy to maintain in tropical environments and possessed a terrifying psychological effect during counterinsurgency operations. The Mustang was no longer just a weapon. It was an export of American influence. For a generation of pilots in the Southern Hemisphere, the roar of the Merlin engine wasn't a sound of the past. It was the sound of their current frontline defense. This proliferation ensured that while the USAF moved on to the F-86 and F-100, the Mustang remained a living, breathing combatant on the world stage for decades. Finally, we must look at the human angle. The men who flew these obsolete machines into the maw of modern anti-aircraft fire. By 1950, many of the pilots called back to fly Mustangs in Korea were World War II veterans who thought they had left combat behind. They were now older, often with families, forced to fly a high-performance aircraft that was notoriously unforgiving. The Mustang stall and the extreme torque of the Merlin engine during takeoff and landing remained lethal to the inexperienced or the rusty. Furthermore, the transition to low-level ground attack meant that these pilots were operating in the most dangerous envelope of flight, where mechanical failure or a lucky shot from a North Korean peasant provided zero margin for error. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots knew that their liquid-cooled engines were vulnerable. They knew that if their coolant out light flickered on, they had perhaps 5 minutes of flight time before the engine welded itself into a solid block of hot iron. This created a unique culture of Mustang men in the 1950s. Pilots who respected the aircraft's legendary history, but were acutely aware of its mortality in a world of radar-aimed flak and jet-powered interceptors. Men like Major George Andrew Davis, Jr., a World War II ace who returned to fly Mustangs in Korea before transitioning to jets, embodied this bridge. For these men, The Mustang was a beautiful but lethal trap, a thoroughbred that demanded perfection even as the world around it was moving toward the push-button warfare of the missile age. The climax of the P-51's post-war saga began not with a celebration, but with a desperate, bloody necessity. In June 1950, as the North Korean People's Army shattered the defenses of the ROK forces, the United States military realized it had a catastrophic problem. Its premier jet fighter, the F-80 Shooting Star, was a marvel of engineering but a failure of logistics in the rugged terrain of the Korean peninsula. The jets required long, paved runways that didn't exist in the South, and their fuel consumption was so voracious that they could only spend approximately 15 minutes over the target area before having to retreat to Japan. The obsolete Mustang was suddenly the only platform capable of saving the crumbling perimeter at Pusan. In an operation of frantic urgency, the U.S. Navy's aircraft carrier USS Boxer was loaded with 145 F-51s, stripped from Air National Guard hangars across the United States. These weren't factory-new machines. They were weekend warriors that had been sitting in hangars from California to Kentucky. When they arrived in theater, they were immediately thrust into the most brutal close-air support campaign in history. Operating from primitive, dirt-clogged strips dubbed K-bases, the Mustang pilots flew in conditions that would have grounded any other aircraft. They were the fire brigade, called in to drop napalm on T-34 tanks that were mere hundreds of yards from American foxholes. The intensity of the Mustang service in 1950 was unparalleled. Unlike the high-altitude escort missions over Germany, where pilots might go weeks without seeing an enemy, the Korea-based F-51s were flying 3 or 4 sorties a day. They operated in the dead man zone, below $1,000 feet, where every North Korean soldier with a submachine gun was a potential threat. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine, so magnificent at $30,000 feet, proved to be a liability in the valleys of the North. If a single fragment of shrapnel pierced the radiator, the pilot had a harrowing choice: bail out over enemy territory or try to dead stick the heavy fighter into a rice paddy. By the end of the first year of the war, the Mustang had accounted for more than half of all enemy ground targets destroyed by the Air Force, but the cost was a staggering 157 aircraft lost to ground fire. As the winter of 1950 descended, the war in the skies took a terrifying technological leap. On November 1st, a flight of F-51 Mustangs patrolling near the Yalu River encountered a sight that seemed to defy the laws of physics: swept-wing shadows moving at speeds nearly double their own. These were the Soviet-made MiG-15s, the apex predators of the new jet age. For the first time in history, the Mustang was no longer just technically outclassed. It was a sitting duck. The air-to-air environment had become a realm of Mach numbers and high subsonic closure rates, leaving the 440 miles per hour Mustang struggling to even bring its sights to bear on an enemy that could vanish into the clouds before a single .50 caliber round was fired. Yet, the climax of the Mustang's combat career was defined by its refusal to retreat. While the newly arrived F-86 Sabres took over the high-altitude MiG alley sweeps, the Mustangs were doubled down in the valleys. This culminated in the brutal battles around the Chosin Reservoir. In sub-zero temperatures that caused the Mustang's oil to thicken into sludge and its control cables to freeze, the F-51 became the only lifeline for 30,000 trapped Marines. Pilots like Lieutenant Dean Hess, a former minister turned combat flyer, led the Bout 1 project, training South Korean pilots to fly the Mustang, while personally leading strikes against Chinese human wave attacks. The Mustang's final sortie as a primary U.S. combatant arrived in 1953. By then, the airframe was physically exhausted. The constant stress of pulling high-G pullouts from dive-bombing runs had warped many of the wings, and the supply of spare Merlin engine parts was dwindling. On January 23, 1953, the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing, the last major USAF unit flying the Mustang in Korea, finally traded their F-51s for F-86 Sabres. It was a somber transition. Many pilots wept as they watched their Mustangs being taxied to the scrap piles or handed over to the Republic of Korea Air Force. The thoroughbred had stayed in the race long enough to see its successor cross the finish line, having flown over 62,000 sorties in Korea alone. It was the end of an era for the United States Air Force. The piston-engine fighter would never again lead an American charge into battle. The conclusion of the Korean War did not signal the immediate death of the Mustang, but rather its migration into the shadows of the Cold War. While the United States Air Force fully committed to a century series of supersonic jets, the F-51 was relegated to the Air National Guard and, eventually, the international surplus market. However, the Mustang refused to become a mere museum piece. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the aircraft became the weapon of choice for brush fire wars across the globe. The most striking chapter of this aftermath occurred in Central America. Under the Military Assistance Program, the U.S. distributed hundreds of Mustangs to nations like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, where they became the primary instruments of state power. This culminated in the surreal events of the 1969 Soccer War between El Salvador and Honduras. In a world where the United States was landing men on the moon and flying Mach 2 Phantoms over Vietnam, two neighboring nations engaged in a brutal, week-long conflict using the piston-driven icons of 1944. Salvadoran P-51s found themselves in desperate dogfights against Honduran F-41 Corsairs. It was a bizarre, anachronistic echo of the Pacific Theater, fought 25 years too late. These were the final recorded instances of propeller-driven fighters engaging in air-to-air combat, a violent and final crescendo for a machine that had outlived its tactical era by nearly 3 decades. Domestically, the Mustang's afterlife took a different, though no less intense, path. As the Air National Guard phased out their last F-51DS in 1957, a new breed of pilot emerged, the civilian warbird collector. Initially, these aircraft were viewed as high-performance toys for the wealthy or daring. Men like Cavalier Aircraft Corporation's David Lindsay saw a future for the Mustang as a high-speed executive transport. Cavalier began buying up surplus F-51s, stripping them of their guns, and refurbishing them with luxurious interiors and advanced avionics. These Cavalier Mustangs represented a strange metamorphosis. The world's deadliest fighter converted into a corporate shuttle, a thoroughbred forced to wear a tuxedo. Yet, beneath the civilian paint, the airframe remained a weapon, a fact that would eventually lead the U.S. government to revisit the Mustang one last time for the counterinsurgency needs of the Vietnam era. As the 1960s bled into the 70s, the Mustang found a new, high-octane sanctuary, the world of unlimited air racing. In the high desert of Nevada, the Reno Air Races became the ultimate proving ground for the surviving P-51s. No longer burdened by the weight of 6.50 caliber machine guns or armored plating, the airframes were pushed to their absolute breaking point. Engineers and mechanics began clipping the wings and modifying the Merlin engines to produce over $3,000 horsepower, double their wartime rating. Legendary aircraft like Miss Ashley II, Voodoo, and Striga became household names in the aviation community. These were not mere displays of speed. They were brutal tests of the Mustang's structural integrity, with pilots screaming around pylons at over $500 mph, just 50 feet off the ground. This racing culture birthed a global movement of warbird restoration. By the 1980s, this surplus mentality had vanished, replaced by a deep, almost spiritual reverence for the aircraft. The price of a Mustang, which had bottomed out at $500 in the late 40s, began to skyrocket, eventually crossing the $1 million mark. Restoration shops like Air Corps Aviation began using original factory blueprints to rebuild Mustangs from the data plate up, ensuring that every rivet and hydraulic line was historically accurate. The Mustang transitioned from a weapon of war to a masterpiece of industrial art. For the public, seeing a P-51 at an air show wasn't just a lesson in history. It was a sensory experience. The whistle of the gun ports, and the guttural roar of the Merlin engine serving as a living link to a generation that was rapidly fading away. Parallel to this civilian rebirth, the Mustang made one final, brief appearance in military development. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. looked at the Mustang's airframe as a candidate for the coin counterinsurgency role. This led to the creation of the Piper P-48 Enforcer, a turboprop-powered evolution of the Mustang. Although it shared the silhouette of the P-51, the Enforcer was a completely different beast, featuring modern ordnance and a Lycoming T-55 engine. While the Enforcer never went into mass production, its existence proved that the basic aerodynamic geometry of the Mustang was so perfect that, even 40 years after its first flight, it was still being considered for the front lines of American power. The Mustang had finally ceased being a weapon of the present and had become a legend of the permanent past. The story of the P-51 Mustang after 1945 is not a story of decline, but of a strange and enduring immortality. Most weapons of war are born for a single purpose and discarded when that purpose is served, left to rust in the quiet corners of history. But the Mustang defied the natural life cycle of military technology. It was a machine that refused to stay in the past. From the desperate, frozen ridgelines of Korea to the sweltering jungles of Central America, it proved that brilliance in design is timeless. The Mustang was the final, perfect expression of the piston engine era, a peak from which aviation could only move forward by changing its very nature. Today, the Mustang occupies a space that transcends its original role as a killer of men. When we see one bank over an airfield today, we aren't just looking at a fighter. We're looking at the ultimate symbol of a global pivot point. It represents the moment industrial might met aerodynamic grace, and the moment a generation of citizen soldiers took to the sky to decide the fate of the modern world. Its post-war journey, from a $1 $500 surplus item to a $3 million piece of living history, reflects our own changing relationship with the 20th century. We preserve the Mustang because it is a tactile, screaming reminder of what it felt like to be on the edge of the future. The Merlin engine's roar is a sound that refuses to be silenced by the passage of time. As long as there is blue sky and a pilot with the courage to tame the thoroughbred, the Mustang will fly. It is no longer a weapon of the United States Air Force, nor an instrument of geopolitical influence. It has become something far more permanent, an icon of human ingenuity and a monument to the airmen who lived, fought, and sometimes died within its narrow cockpit. The Mustang didn't just survive the end of World War II. It conquered history itself.